The questions began quietly, almost as background noise, until they gathered enough momentum to dominate every discussion surrounding the Whittaker family. It wasn't just about money anymore, or broken promises, or fractured loyalties. A new curiosity emerged, sharper and more unsettling. Someone was whispering into Betty Whittaker's ear. Someone who appeared suddenly, inserted themselves into her daily life, and, according to several accounts, began controlling access to her. And what made this development even more alarming was the rumor that this person was tied, directly or indirectly, to Eric. The conversation shifted dramatically once people began to realize that Betty was no longer freely speaking with those she once trusted. For a long time, she had communicated with certain individuals multiple times a day. The connections seemed genuine, built on familiarity and mutual concern. Then, without warning, a barrier appeared between her and the outside world. People who once could call her and receive an immediate answer suddenly found themselves blocked, filtered, or redirected. The reason for the shift remained murky until one name surfaced: Gloria. The arrival of this woman in Betty's space raised eyebrows instantly. She wasn't part of the Whittaker family. She wasn't a longtime friend. She hadn't grown up in Odd, West Virginia. Yet she began regulating conversations, positioning herself as a gatekeeper, and assuming the authority to decide who could speak to Betty and who couldn't. Observers questioned the legitimacy of her role, especially when rumors spread that she was affiliated with Eric or those close to him. For some, this revelation explained too much. It clarified why communication patterns changed so abruptly. It explained why Betty suddenly seemed hesitant, uncertain, or overly protected when speaking. It highlighted the possibility that the information reaching her and the information leaving was being curated, shaped, or even manipulated. People began wondering whether Betty's decisions were truly her own or influenced by the person standing closest to her. This discovery came at a delicate moment for the family. Betty was reportedly considering signing documents related to the ongoing financial dispute, and the idea that she might be guided by someone with connections to Eric alarmed those who had been advocating for her rights. They feared she would accept far less than she deserved, simply because she didn't have access to unbiased advice. The added fear was that she would be encouraged to sign quickly, quietly, without a clear understanding of the consequences. One voice in particular expressed strong concern. He argued that Betty's vulnerability made her susceptible to influence from anyone who appeared helpful, anyone who offered transportation, groceries, or companionship. To him, the situation was simple. Unless someone was willing to pay Betty the money she was owed, it wasn't their business to dictate what she accepted. But it was absolutely their business to call out questionable individuals positioning themselves as advisors. The uncomfortable truth was that the Whittakers had never been surrounded by people with their best interests in mind. They had been the subject of fascination, mockery, pity, exploitation, and projection for decades. They lived their quiet, constrained lives on the same porch for 70 years, and the world discovered them only to poke, prod, film, sensationalize, and profit. When people stepped into their lives, it was rarely without personal motives. They were never taught how to navigate the intentions of outsiders. They were never prepared for manipulation disguised as kindness. Betty, like many in her community, lived a life shaped by limitation: financial, educational, structural, social. She wasn't worldly. She wasn't practiced in strategy. She didn't know how to evaluate whether someone was exploiting her. To her, a person who brings groceries or offers a ride can seem like a savior. She wasn't conditioned to question the strings attached. This is why the suspicion that Gloria had ties to Eric caused such uproar. Eric had a long history with the family, a complicated mix of promises and emotional entanglement. His involvement had already raised ethical questions, especially when outsiders began pointing out inconsistencies in his behavior and concern. If someone connected to him now held influence over Betty, it meant the same problematic patterns were repeating. The online community split into groups, trying to untangle the truth. Some believed the affiliation was undeniable. Others cautioned against assumptions. But the concern remained. If the person guiding Betty was aligned with a party who benefited from her accepting less, then Betty was in danger. Not physically, but legally and emotionally. Observers returned to the question of agency. How much control did Betty truly have? How much did she understand about the situation surrounding her? How much of her perspective was shaped by the whispers of the person closest to her? And could anyone, with honesty, answer those questions? Video footage and public comments reinforced the perception that Betty struggled with decision-making. She often appeared overwhelmed, confused, or ambivalent, especially when financial or legal matters were mentioned. She was reactive rather than assertive, agreeable rather than argumentative. For someone like her, influence didn't need to be forceful, it only needed to be present. And presence was what Gloria had established. People who attempted to contact Betty after Gloria's arrival found themselves blocked, redirected, or dismissed. Calls that once came easily were now filtered. Conversations that once flowed now felt monitored. It became clear that Gloria wasn't simply helping Betty, she was managing her. This shift prompted a broader reflection on the ethics of intervention. If someone steps into the life of a vulnerable adult, what responsibilities do they carry? Should they prioritize independence or assume protection? Should they build a barrier or facilitate access? Should they remain neutral or inevitably influence decisions? In Betty's case, neutrality seemed unlikely. It rarely exists when power is unbalanced. For many observers, the heart of the issue wasn't whether someone helped Betty wash clothes, buy groceries, or travel. The issue was whether that support came with invisible expectations. If Gloria was truly connected to Eric, the conflict of interest was undeniable. The idea that someone with ties to a central figure in the financial dispute was whispering guidance into Betty's ear raised red flags across the entire community. Some argued that Betty should know better, but others pushed back, noting that expecting her to navigate manipulation was unrealistic. Her life experience, her isolation, and her lack of resources all shaped her into someone who responded primarily to proximity and assistance, not to hidden motives or long-term consequences. The deeper the conversation went, the more people began questioning the ethical failures surrounding the Whittaker family. Outsiders had entered their lives countless times, making promises they couldn't keep, filming them without fully explaining the outcomes, offering help with hidden strings attached. Some did so for views, others for money, others for influence. And the casual interference of these outsiders had left long-term damage. Throughout all of this, one thing was clear. The family was more fragile than people realized. Their bonds had loosened under pressure. Their trust had frayed. Their simple, quiet world had been disrupted by cameras, channels, and opportunists. And Betty, who had once been stable in her routine, was now being steered by someone who was neither family nor long-term friend. As discussions intensified, people began asking difficult questions about accountability. Should outsiders have been allowed this depth of access to the Whittakers? Should financial decisions have been handled differently? Should warning signs have been noticed earlier? Was Betty ever truly protected? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they highlighted the need for transparency. The community wanted to know who Gloria was, what her intentions were, and why she appeared precisely when Betty faced significant legal and financial choices. From every angle, the question remained the same. Who was whispering to Betty Whittaker, and why? The truth, once fully revealed, would force people to confront things they had overlooked, ignored, or refused to believe. Comment below and share your thoughts. As the conversation surrounding Betty Whittaker intensified, the mystery of the woman guiding her and the motives behind this sudden presence grew more unsettling. Online communities, already fragmented by debates and partial information, turned their attention toward the subtle shifts in Betty's behavior. Her silence sounded different now. Her decisions appeared filtered. Her independence seemed compromised. For years, Betty had been surrounded by chaos she didn't choose. Her family had been thrust into the public eye without preparation, and she had remained the quiet backbone of the household. She cooked, cared for, protected, and endured. She dealt with the routines of poverty with the patience of someone who learned early that survival depended on consistency, not aspiration. So when outsiders entered her world, the disruption was more profound than they realized. The question wasn't simply who was whispering into her ear. It was how easily she could be influenced. Those closest to the situation described a woman who depended heavily on verbal guidance. She relied on relationships, not paperwork. Conversations, not contracts. She wasn't accustomed to legal jargon or financial decisions. When someone spoke with confidence, Betty listened. When someone offered help, Betty trusted. When someone offered transportation or groceries, Betty felt indebted. This was not weakness. It was the natural response of someone who grew up in a world where resources were scarce and vulnerability was constant. This is precisely why the emergence of a gatekeeper like Gloria raised so many alarms. People who once had direct access to Betty suddenly found themselves blocked or dismissed. One day, they could call her multiple times and she would answer. The next, they were told she wasn't available, couldn't talk, wasn't allowed to talk, or had already signed something. The abruptness of the shift suggested someone else had taken control of her communication. Rumors that Gloria was connected to Eric or to Eric's online circle turned concern into suspicion. If those rumors were true, then Betty was under the influence of someone aligned not with her needs, but with the interests of a person at the center of the conflict. Those familiar with the situation noted that the Whittakers had always been vulnerable to exploitation. People showed up with cameras, gifts, promises, and ulterior motives. Some offered support. Others wanted content. A few wanted control. And the saddest part was that the family could rarely tell the difference. Betty, especially, struggled to distinguish kindness from manipulation. For years, she had been conditioned to assume the best, to accept help without questioning intent. Her world had taught her to value gestures. Rides to the store, food deliveries, small conveniences, because her environment offered so few. She didn't have the foundation to ask who benefited from her choices. She didn't have the resources to verify information. She simply trusted those who showed up. That trust had burned her repeatedly. Some observers defended her, saying she was doing the best she could with what she had. Others criticized her, not fully understanding the psychological impact of lifelong poverty and isolation. But most agreed that Betty was not equipped to evaluate complex financial decisions, especially decisions that affected her family's future. This made the timing of Gloria's arrival deeply suspicious. People began examining the dynamic more closely. They noted that Gloria displayed behaviors common in controlling relationships. She managed communication, created dependency, and isolated Betty from her usual support network. She acted as a filter, a monitor, a barrier. She used her physical presence to reinforce authority and her online ties to reinforce legitimacy. The concern wasn't just that Gloria was influencing Betty, it was the direction of that influence. When someone with no family connection positions themselves between a vulnerable woman and the world, the ethical implications are severe. And when that someone appears connected to a person with unresolved obligations to the family, the conflict of interest becomes undeniable. Meanwhile, the broader community tried to map out the roles of everyone involved. They questioned who held power, who benefited from silence, and who gained from limiting Betty's access to unbiased support. They noticed patterns. People close to Eric minimized his responsibility while focusing on the family's failures. They downplayed the money owed. They emphasized dysfunction rather than accountability. They reframed exploitation as generosity. These behavioral patterns weren't new. They echoed tactics used in other online controversies, where influencers surrounded themselves with loyal supporters who defended them at all costs. In this case, if Gloria was part of that network, her presence around Betty could fundamentally reshape the outcome of the financial dispute. The community revisited key moments that now took on new significance. They remembered the times Eric appeared at the Whittakers' home with snacks and gifts, promising assistance that never materialized. They remembered the Tesla lady and the people with cameras who approached the family without explaining the consequences of viral exposure. They remembered the anger of Vegas profiles when their own behavior was questioned. People realized that Betty, despite her strength and endurance, had never been taught to navigate predators disguised as helpers. Her world had changed too fast for her to keep up. As discussions continued, the emotional dimension became impossible to ignore. One of the most painful truths was that Betty's world, her porch, her routine, her family, had once been stable. Limited, yes. Isolated, yes. But emotionally stable. That stability shattered when outsiders began intervening with promises, money, offers, and deals. Suddenly, a woman who had lived the same way for 70 years was thrown into unfamiliar territory. People asked her to sign papers she didn't understand. They asked her to trust them over others. They asked her to participate in deals that complicated her life rather than improved it. Into this chaos stepped Gloria, a figure whose authority came not from history or trust, but from assertiveness and proximity. And Betty, overwhelmed by decisions and desperate for someone to guide her, listened. Those who cared about the family were left wondering how much Betty genuinely understood and how much she was simply agreeing to because she lacked the tools to see through manipulation. The ethical burden of this situation lay heavily on the community. If people knew something was wrong, did they have a responsibility to intervene? Or did that risk repeating the pattern of outsiders imposing themselves on the family? Some argued for legal oversight. Others insisted the family needed an advocate unconnected to any content creator. But everyone agreed that someone needed to protect Betty, not from herself, but from the individuals who recognized her vulnerability and saw opportunity in it. As more information surfaced, the suspicions surrounding Gloria intensified. People uncovered details suggesting she was not merely a passive helper, but an active participant with her own motivations. She had a history in online communities, connections with moderators and creators, and a pattern of inserting herself into vulnerable spaces. The possibility that she was influencing Betty's decisions for someone else's benefit became harder to ignore. This led to the next question, one that the community couldn't avoid any longer. Who stands to gain the most from controlling Betty? The answers varied, but all pointed back to the same core issue: money, control, and narrative. Controlling Betty meant controlling the story. Controlling the story meant controlling public opinion. And controlling public opinion meant controlling accountability. People realized that if Betty could be convinced to sign documents that minimized what she was owed, the conflict could be framed as resolved. Patrick could appear generous. Eric could appear concerned. The narrative could be rewritten to erase uncomfortable truths. But none of that served Betty. As the conversation evolved, viewers confronted the disturbing reality that Betty's well-being depended not on the loudest voices online, but on the quietest whisper in her ear. Someone was speaking into that space and influencing her at her most vulnerable moment. The identity, motives, and reach of that person would shape the path forward. This was no longer merely a family drama. It was a battle over influence, access, and control. Comment below and share your thoughts. As the days passed, the whispers surrounding Betty Whittaker became louder than the conversations she was actually allowed to have. More people started stepping forward, sharing stories of their attempts to reach her, only to be blocked by the same voice answering her phone, the same woman intercepting questions, the same scripted phrases repeated as explanations. Communication had shifted from open and informal to controlled and filtered, and it alarmed those who understood just how fragile the situation was. Betty was no stranger to hardship, but she was new to manipulation disguised as protection. Her world, once small and predictable, had expanded through exposure, and with that expansion came people who studied her vulnerabilities. They learned what she needed, what she lacked, and what she responded to. They understood the emotional currency of attention and assistance. And in environments like that, influence didn't appear as coercion, it appeared as help. This is what made the presence of the whispering figure so effective and so dangerous. People who genuinely cared for the Whittaker family could sense the shift immediately. Betty, once reachable and conversational, now seemed guarded or distracted. She repeated lines that sounded coached. She hesitated before answering simple questions. And whenever she seemed unsure, the voice of Gloria or someone standing near her would enter the conversation and complete her sentences. This change didn't occur naturally. It occurred gradually, after someone placed themselves firmly between Betty and the outside world. Observers began piecing together subtle clues. They noticed Betty referring to information she'd never known before meeting Gloria, repeating opinions she had never voiced until that moment, and adopting stances that aligned suspiciously well with narratives circulating within Eric's online circles. The connection became harder to dismiss as coincidence. When people realized that Gloria might have allegiances elsewhere, the pattern became clear. Betty wasn't forming her own opinions. She was absorbing someone else's. For many, this triggered outrage, not because Betty was incapable, but because she was trusting. Trust is a gift, but when placed in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. Those close to the case started expressing the concern that whatever Betty signed, agreed to, or accepted during this period likely did not come from her understanding, but from someone else's framing. This framing became even more problematic when decisions about money resurfaced. Betty had long been owed funds that were promised publicly, reinforced privately, and never delivered. Yet now, under the guidance of the whispering presence, she seemed increasingly willing to settle for far less. People who had spoken to her previously described her as confused about numbers, unclear about the terms, and unaware of her own bargaining power. With Gloria nearby, that confusion never translated into caution. It translated into compliance. The situation mirrored patterns seen in cases of soft coercion. No one shouted. No one threatened. No one forced. Instead, influence was applied through proximity, convenience, emotional support, and selective information. This form of control is often more effective than aggression because it masks itself as benevolence. And in Betty's life, where genuine help was rare, the appearance of benevolence carried tremendous weight. While the community debated the implications of this, another dimension of the story surfaced: the psychological environment surrounding the Whittaker family. Their entire identity had been shaped by years of curiosity from outsiders who neither understood nor respected their lifestyle. People stared, judged, filmed, speculated, and sensationalized. They were treated as characters long before anyone attempted to understand them as people. The trauma of that visibility made the family more susceptible to external influence. When the world sees your home as content, your vulnerability becomes entertainment. When people perceive your existence as a spectacle, they approach with agendas rather than empathy. This was the environment into which Gloria stepped, a place where Betty was conditioned to believe that anyone offering help was doing so out of kindness, not ulterior motives. As the discussion grew, people also revisited the role of those who came before Gloria: the visitors with cameras, the content creators with promises, the people who drove up to the Whittaker home with snacks, gifts, or recording device. Each of them left some form of residue behind. Expectations unmet, confusion deepened, relationships strained. Eric was among the earliest and most influential of those figures. He approached the family as a creator, offering assistance and friendship, only to leave them in a worse position than before. His promises of financial relief, improved living conditions, and emotional support dissolved into a series of inconsistent actions. This inconsistency made the idea of someone connected to him, now whispering into Betty's ear, even more troubling. Now, viewers began asking deeper questions about influence and narrative. If Betty's decisions were shaped by Gloria, and if Gloria's influences were tied to Eric, then Betty's choices were not truly her own. This raised ethical red flags for anyone paying attention. The family's autonomy was already fragile. Now it seemed compromised entirely. Meanwhile, the community attempted to understand why Betty seemed more withdrawn from those who genuinely tried to help. Some suggested Gloria created distance deliberately, presenting herself as a necessary filter to protect Betty from outsiders. Others believed Betty complied simply because she feared confrontation or consequences. But the most compelling explanation was the simplest. Betty followed whoever stood closest to her, because she had no framework for evaluating competing motivations. This lack of framework is common in environments shaped by isolation. When your world has always been small, your ability to discern influence remains small as well. Some began describing Betty's situation in terms of power imbalance. Gloria held transportation, access, resources, and companionship. Betty held trust. The exchange was not equal. And in the presence of unequal exchanges, it is always the vulnerable party who pays the price. People reflected on the countless unseen moments in Betty's life. Moments when she might have expressed uncertainty, only to be overridden by someone with more confidence. Moments when she might have hesitated, only to be nudged into agreement with soothing words. Moments when she might have questioned a detail, only to accept a rehearsed explanation rather than seek clarification. These moments compound into decision-making that is no longer independent. The true tragedy wasn't that someone was whispering to Betty, it was that no one had ever taught her how to evaluate the whispers. As concerns grew, some suggested that the situation required legal intervention. Others argued Betty needed an advocate with no ties to any online figure. A few insisted the community must escalate the issue to protect her from signing documents she didn't understand. But even as people debated solutions, one truth loomed above everything else. Someone with influence over Betty stood to benefit from her confusion. This realization reframed the entire narrative. If Betty accepted a low settlement, who gained? If Betty signed without legal support, who gained? If Betty stopped communicating with those who questioned the situation, who gained? Every path led back to the people positioned closest to her, not physically, but strategically. The online conversation reached a boiling point when people began posting their own experiences with manipulative intermediaries inserted into vulnerable families. Stories from other cases echoed similar patterns. A single outside figure acting as gatekeeper, limiting communication, filtering information, and guiding decisions. In every case, the consequences were devastating. Betty's situation was unfolding the same way. Only this time the entire process was recorded in real time through messages, live streams, and commentary. The world watched as influence tightened around her like a quiet, invisible rope. People began asking the painful question, was Gloria protecting Betty, or was she protecting someone else's interests? Nothing about the situation appeared accidental. The deeper viewers looked, the clearer the pattern became. Betty was being managed. Every sign pointed to it. And the more managed she became, the easier it was for outside parties to redirect the narrative, minimize accountability, and shape outcomes. Betty was not choosing freely. Her voice was being shaped. Her decisions were being steered. Her world, once small but stable, was now small and tightly controlled. Viewers realized that the mystery of who was whispering to Betty had become larger than one woman's identity. It had become a question of responsibility, exploitation, and intent. Because whispers are not harmless when spoken into the ear of someone who trusts blindly. The truth about who controlled the narrative and why they needed it controlled was about to unfold. Comment below and share your thoughts. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Betty wasn't speaking for herself anymore. People who had known her long enough recognized the difference immediately. Her language changed. Her tone shifted. Her words sounded borrowed rather than formed from her own thoughts. She responded as if coached, guided, or prompted by someone standing close enough to influence every sentence. And the woman facilitating that shift, the whispering presence, remained a figure whose motives were still unclear, but whose impact was undeniable. The heart of the concern was simple. Betty was in a vulnerable position, and someone had stepped into her life at precisely the moment when influence would be most effective. It raised questions not only about who this person was, but why she appeared now, and what she hoped to gain through access to a woman at the center of a growing financial and emotional conflict. The patterns around Betty's decision-making painted an even more troubling picture. The fact that she was considering legal documents she didn't fully understand meant that whoever whispered in her ear wielded immense power. A signature from Betty could end the dispute before it began. It could minimize accountability. It could benefit certain individuals while robbing her of what she was owed. And the community began to see how the whispering presence fit into a larger context of control. For years, people had stepped into the Whittakers' lives claiming to help, but leaving damage behind. Some came with cameras, exploiting the family for viral content. Others came with sympathy that quickly turned into manipulation. Still others arrived with promises, only to disappear once the content was filmed or the attention faded. The Whittakers had lived through many kinds of exploitation, but this was different. This wasn't someone filming their porch for entertainment. This was someone shaping the choices of a family already struggling. It was more subtle, but far more dangerous. Betty had always lived a life defined by routine and isolation. Her entire world revolved around her porch, her family, and the limited resources she managed to stretch each month. In that world, anyone who offered help appeared trustworthy simply because help had always been hard to find. When someone started whispering guidance into her life, Betty didn't see manipulation. She saw companionship. She saw certainty. She saw a voice that sounded confident in a world where she felt uncertain. The influence worked because it filled a void she had never been able to articulate. The need for someone to take her seriously, to guide her, to talk to her, as if her decisions mattered. But decisions under influence are not choices. They are responses. This distinction became crucial as the community pieced together the timeline. People noted that the more Gloria inserted herself into Betty's life, the more isolated Betty became from those who challenged or questioned the situation. She withdrew from those who tried to help her think critically. She stopped responding to familiar numbers. She stopped seeking clarification. She relied solely on the person closest to her. Control thrives in isolation. The more dependent Betty became, the more power the whispering figure held. And in that dependency, Betty's vulnerability deepened. She was no longer making decisions for herself. She was adopting the decisions presented to her. The community watched all of this unfold with increasing concern, not because they doubted Betty's intelligence, but because they understood how influence works when placed in the hands of the wrong person. Manipulation does not require force. It requires access, repetition, and trust. Betty had offered all three without realizing the consequences. As word spread about the possible affiliation between Gloria and Eric, the motives became even more suspicious. If the person guiding Betty had ties to someone with financial or narrative interests in the outcome, then Betty was being shaped for someone else's advantage. She wasn't being protected. She was being positioned. People began articulating the most painful truth. The Whittaker family had never been given a fair chance to determine their own fate. Every outsider who entered their world brought complications instead of clarity. Every promise came with conditions. Every act of help came with an agenda. Betty was tired. She was overwhelmed. And like many who grow up without support, she accepted guidance from whoever appeared when she needed help most. She never learned how to question motives. She never learned how to weigh options. She had spent her life surviving, not negotiating. This is what made her so susceptible to whispers. This is what made the situation so dangerous. And this is what made the community's concern turn into urgency. A woman whose entire life had been confined to a porch could not be expected to navigate the complexities of legal documents, financial settlements, or social manipulation. She deserved advocates, not influencers. She deserved fairness, not pressure. She deserved someone who would explain her options, not exploit her confusion. Betty's story reflected a larger problem. A system in which vulnerable people are guided by those with the most confidence, not the most integrity. And the Whittaker family was bearing the consequences of that imbalance. As everything came to light, the most unsettling question remained the simplest. If someone is whispering into Betty Whittaker's ear, steering her decisions, limiting her communication, and shaping her responses, can she truly speak for herself anymore? The truth became clear, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Until the whispers stop, Betty's voice will never be fully her own. Comment below and share your thoughts. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.